So it's the third and final day of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's state visit to the United States. What has been achieved? We have seen a lot of pomp and ceremony and grandeur, but in substantive terms, what has been achieved? Joining me now is Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, Tanvi Madan. Thank you so much for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. So you've seen the pictures on TV, the state ceremonies, the dinner and all of that. But along the way, if you were to separate the wheat from the chaff, what is the substance of this visit? What will this visit be remembered for?
You know, I think there were a phrase each that President Biden and Prime Minister Modi said that I think encapsulates the theme of this trip. And the phrase that President Biden used was that together we shall unlock a shared future. And the Prime Minister used the term a new dawn, quoting Amanda Gorman, the poet. And I think the reason they say that is because if you look at the actual fact sheets and the joint statement, what you're seeing is not just one or two deals, and they were concrete deals. This had more deliverables than I expected. But underlying all that is a tying together of the two countries' economies, societies, even militaries to some extent, with obviously the strategic autonomy preserved of India. But really to say, look, we as governments are going to enable this. But this is really about building a future-oriented economic, technological, innovation, and yes, security a relationship that feeds into our objectives of security, prosperity, and resilience. So to me, that's kind of the theme. And what they've done is they've laid the groundwork. So now it's a question of implementation. But to me, if this works, 10 years from now, we'll say this trip is historic if this gets implemented, because it has the potential to actually tie the systems together in a way that is if not unprecedented, not something that happens very often.
So we'll talk about the security partnership and all this transfer of technology stuff, but I think one of the underlying things, or at least this seemed to be sort of heard in the rooms yesterday, that America made a bet on China 30, 40 years ago, and there was 30 years of great economic prosperity between the Deng era and just before Xi Jinping came in. And clearly China could not have done that without America making that bet on China. Is America, through this visit, is President Biden, is the entire ecosystem here basically saying we're willing to make that same bet on India for the next 10, 20, 30 years because we feel that India is our natural ally. India is the partner that we're looking for, not just in the Asia-Pacific because of its own, geopolitical constraints and so on, but generally for the longer term. Do you see that message coming out of this visit?
So I don't like the term bet because it suggests it's a one-time play for a one-time payoff. I prefer the term investment because this is not just this administration. It is previous administrations from both parties. And frankly, it's also not just the U.S. making an investment. It's India making an investment in the relationship, overcoming, as the Prime Minister says, the hesitations of history. So I think this is about, but it's more than what the U.S. did with China, because I do think, it's kind of the throwaway line at the end, the people to people or the diaspora. But it is, and even the shared values, people say, oh, it's just a check, something that's checked, a box that's checked. But that's the special sauce in the relationship, which means you're tying together. It's not just a business case. So, with China, it was like, this is going to be the country that's the counterbalance to the Soviet Union. And yes, American business eventually said market access. I think this is really about, you didn't see that tying up of ecosystems. You saw tying up of economies maybe. But you're seeing the U.S. now, over the last 25 years, say this is a country with which, because India for its own right, will be an important player. There is an attraction here, special attraction to the fact that India is a democracy and, like the US, is a diverse democracy. That gives it in kind of added value here. And so the idea that, and you've seen multiple administrations say it, that India's rise is in American national interest and therefore is worth supporting, is something that is not just of today, not just because of the kind of China challenge that both share. It is because of this broader economic, technological, societal relationship. Having said that, I would be the first person to tell you that anybody who tells you this is not about China is kind of being a very polite or trying to kind of not mention the C word, right? You can call it the Voldemort of the relationship. He shall not be named. I'm told the younger kids get the more kind of, we don't talk about Bruno, I guess, is what they say. We don't talk about China. But it is about China in at least two ways, right? It provides the context in which the two countries are moving forward security, economic, technological cooperation because of shared concerns about China's not just geopolitical moves, but their kind of the concern about economic and technological ties with them need to de-risk. So I think China is providing that additional fuel in the relationship to really speed it up and scale it up. I think the second thing that China helps do is because there's the strategic imperatives, the differences that come up between the US and India, they're incentivized to manage it, including on the question of Russia.
I just want to talk about, again, since you mentioned democracy, and we heard this a lot in all of the speeches that we heard yesterday. And frankly, the whole idea of democracy and shared values, it's a phrase that we've been seeing in the Indo-US bilateral for the last 20 years. But when you talk about that, I think the limits of this relationship are also sort of coming to the fore, because I think there is a realization that Indian democracy is working the Indian way, and there are certain shortfalls as the American view is, or, including on the question of minority rights and press freedoms and so on. The question was asked to both the President and the Prime Minister yesterday. What is the view on that here in Washington? That yes, while we are willing to make this bet on India and Mr. Modi and his government, but there is this little bit of an issue that's a bother.
The U.S. investment is in India, and it is just as it's been for multiple administrations here, it's also across multiple governments in India, because they do believe in the idea of India. It's also not just a values argument, right? So there is the values argument. Yes, they see India as perhaps most like America in this way. They might have partnerships with countries in the Anglosphere, but they definitely don't have the kind of diversity that India does. I think also there's always been this element of that India can prove the theory of the case, that democracy and development aren't mutually exclusive. So there is that aspect. There's also a view here which President Biden suggested in his response, that democracies tend to be less externally assertive or make fewer bad decisions externally. That's an allusion to both President Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping, that they live in closed bubbles and make bad choices because of that. But I think there's also a strategic imperative that people here do see. They want to see an India that is thriving, that has the capabilities and is focused on playing the regional and global role that the U.S. wants it to, and frankly that most Indians want India to play that larger role on the world stage. And from a strategic perspective, they're concerned that you go back to times in India's history like the 1980s where it was so focus on internal security challenges that it couldn't play that role. So there's that strategic imperative that people see in terms of democracy. And then as the U.S. looks to diversify and de-risk through diversification, having had a bad experience with China, they are looking for partners that are more transparent, that are more open, that are more predictable. And so they see kind of the democratic side, the fact that there's rule of law in India as part of that contrast. So you do see, and it's not just, Democrats might write a letter, but even for Republicans, things like religious freedom matter. Is it a limit to the relationship? I still think on balance, democracy is more of a strength than this thing. I think people should be less oversensitive about comments that are made, because at the end of the day, you also had the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan say, look, at the end of the day, what happens in politics in India is for Indians to choose. It's not for the United States to choose. So I think there's a recognition of the limits. But I think when somebody here is stating that what makes India attractive as a partner is democracy and they have concerns, I actually think Indians should be concerned about the state of democracy in the U.S. I don't think many people here would have a problem if India actually says, look, we have an interest in the U.S. that is united, that is not full of friction, because it will not be able to play a role in the Indo-Pacific that we want to. So I think it's just natural. These are open societies. People will make comments. This is not China where suddenly, there should be an oversensitive thing, because, if the argument is India's democracy is strong, then, as the Prime Minister did, defend it.
All right. Thank you very much, Tanvi, for speaking with us. So that was Tanvi Madan with camera person Ravindra Kumar here at the Brookings Institution in Washington. This is Zaka Jacob for CNN News 18.